We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are.
Absolutely.
The colour of my water bottle, we might label it the same, but there is absolutely no way to verify that your experience is the same as my experience. We've just learnt to call it the same thing. For someone with auditory visual synesthesia, sound is also a visual experience. So, for example, A might evoke a particular deep maroon, and every time they see, hear, or think about the letter A, that particular colour is as much part of it as the strokes that make up a capital A, for example.
Dr. Anina Rich is a cognitive neuroscientist and professor of cognitive science at Macquarie University, heading the Perception in Action Research Centre and Australia's flagship Synesthesia research group. Dr. Rich studies the brains of people who taste triangles, feel violin notes brushing their skin, and watch Mondays glow pastel pink. Her studies of these sensory mashups prove that when a synesthete swears the number 7 erupts in neon orange, it's because colour circuits hijack the visual cortex. By tracing these crosslinks, Rich has exposed a universal secret. Every mind blends sight, sound, and touch to predict reality. Synesthetes just have the volume turned all the way up. Subscribe if you want to know why your Tuesdays might actually be blue and how mastering attention can let you hack the code your brain writes for reality.
It's highly unlikely, in my view, that synesthetes have a fundamentally different brain to the rest of us. I think it's far more likely that what we have is a dimensional human experience. Synesthesia might be at the extreme end, or maybe it shows us insights into things that are unconscious in the rest of us.
What do you think are some of the biggest things we've learned about conscious experience through the study of synesthesia? Dr. Anina Rich, do we all experience the same reality?
Well, there's never a way that we can actually answer that question. I can only say that we have no way of verifying that we experience the same reality. And in all likelihood, we don't. So there's lots of phenomena that demonstrate that what we think is going on in the world is quite different to what might actually be going on. And in the phenomenon of synesthesia, we have a really nice illustration of how just by using language, we can identify that actually we might be having quite a different experience of the world around us.
Yeah. What is synesthesia? Let's explain from first principles kind of what we know about synesthesia.
So synesthesia is an umbrella term that can relate to a lot of different phenomena, but broadly it's where an ordinary event, such as a sound or a letter or a smell, evokes an extraordinary experience, meaning something that isn't evoked for most of us. So for most of us, a sound is an auditory experience. That bit's okay. But for someone with auditory visual synesthesia, that sound is also a visual experience. So different sounds will evoke different visual experiences. And it's as much a part of that stimulus, or that event, as for us, the auditory component. For some people, smells have a visual component, so that every time they experience a particular smell, it also evokes a particular visual object, for example, or a particular colour. Most commonly, letters and numbers evoke experiences of colour, and it tends to be quite consistent. So, for example, A might evoke a particular deep maroon, and every time they see, hear, or think about the letter A, that particular colour is as much part of it as the strokes that make up a capital A, for example.
Right. They'll argue to you that a particular number has an emotion as so far as it does have a quantifiable number. You know, like a number 4 is aggressive in exactly the same way as that it's useful for counting 4 of things. Like it's almost an equal property in their mind. Would that be right? Like they're so consistent with their synesthetic associations that it means both things almost equally.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. I mean, the actual emotion associated with numbers is one form of synesthesia. Other people have, certain numbers have certain personalities. That's sort of less common in a way, or maybe less studied.
Yes.
But certainly, yeah. So the notion of a colour being associated with a letter, it's not, oh, A, I think that could be red, like those of us who are non-synesthetes might say. It's that, of course, A is deeply and fundamentally this particular shade of red.
Yes. I find it so fascinating. I love synesthesia. I think it's so interesting. I've kind of been on this whole track of really trying to understand people's inner experience. And as you mentioned, I think very well at the start, synesthesia is a very good example that you can point to and say, okay, well, I definitely don't experience numbers as having emotions. That's definitely a conscious experience that we are differing in. So it's a good example that we aren't experiencing the same reality, even though I think those examples are much more numerous. And maybe even your diagram behind you can help explain how we don't always experience the same reality. But what other forms of synesthesia are most common? What can be seen most? What's most studied? What's most common?
I think so. Having colours for letters and numbers or linguistic stimuli seems to be really quite common, and also having visual experiences that go with sounds. But there's lots and lots of forms of synesthesia, and I feel like there's more and more coming to light all the time. There's a fantastic international synesthesia association, and Professor Sean Day runs a synesthesia list where he's got synesthetes describing all sorts of different types of experiences. One of the ones that we're just starting to look at is actually maybe more common than we realised, and that is where visual motion actually evokes sounds. So forms of synesthesia tend to be unidirectional. So a sound will give a colour, but colours don't tend to give sounds. And in visual motion synesthesia, it's one of the rarer ones in the sense that the evoked experience isn't colour. So for a lot of them, the evoked experience is colour. It may be a coloured shape, it may be a coloured form. So for sounds, there's often a type of motion associated with it. But usually there's a component of colour. And we're starting to look at some of those forms where colour is not the evoked experience. And in this case, visual motion induced sounds can be really compelling. And we're just starting to look at that. There's a few studies out in the literature, including a really nice study where they have an objective measure of synesthesia, in that when you see flashes, it's quite difficult to detect patterns. But if you hear different tones like Morse code, where the auditory system is very well defined, very well evolved to detect patterns. And so you can imagine, if I show you flashes and you hear a sound, you should be better at detecting patterns than someone who doesn't have that auditory component.
Right.
There's a couple of really nice studies suggesting that people with this type of synesthesia are better at detecting the patterns in visual flashes, presumably because they have that auditory component. So that's a really interesting form of synesthesia. It might tell us some different things to what we've been studying in the colour space. But there's a whole host. We've done some studies on mirror touch synesthesia, which is when you see someone being touched and you actually feel it yourself.
Right.
I had a PhD student who's now graduated, she's now Dr. Sophie Smith, who did some really nice work looking at mirror touch synesthesia and this idea that maybe it's a continuum. So there's different ways of thinking about synesthesia, and some people think of it as categorically different. So synesthetes have different connections and pathways in their brains that don't exist in the rest of us, and that's why they have these additional experiences. So they're sort of a category apart. My view is that there's very little data to really strongly support that argument, and particularly because what's happening in our brain changes all the time, right? The brains are plastic, and the more you use a particular pathway, the stronger it's going to get. So we can't really say that just because, for example, synesthetes might have a bit more white matter connecting two areas, that they're fundamentally different.
Right.
I think the body of the data suggests that there's a continuum of normal experience, and synesthetes might be on the extreme end. So, for example, in the vicarious touch literature that Sophie was looking at, it's possible for those of us who wouldn't identify as synesthetes to still have this feeling that you can actually feel that video, for example,
Yes.
or that visceral reaction when you see someone being stabbed. And the question is, how much is that related to those extremes of somebody who in daily life avoids the movies because every time they see, a sex scene or a gory scene, it actually physically affects them.
Right.
And what Sophie found was that if we have highly controlled videos of particular type of touches, in a general population sample, a lot of people report that they actually experience that touch.
Yes.
Similarly, in our the visual motion to sound synesthesia research that we're just starting, we're looking to see whether or not it's more common than we think that under certain circumstances, all of us might report that we kind of hear something even though there's nothing there to hear.
Right.
So there's some really interesting, I think, insights that we can get from synesthesia on how we all process the world around us, how the information from our different senses is integrated, and how it integrates with the knowledge that we already have about the world, right? We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are.
Absolutely.
So we end up with both a reminder of how inherently subjective perception is, right? So you and I might discuss the color of my water bottle as being blue, and we might label it the same, that there is absolutely no way to verify that your experience of this reflected light is the same as my experience. We've just learned to call it the same thing, right? So it's true of all of us for perception. It's just that synesthesia is this really nice example, because when you describe things in language, all of a sudden you go, well, hang on, I don't experience Tuesdays as blue. So this is something different is happening here. And it gives us this opportunity to really look at the dimensions of human experience, because often when you have an extreme experience, it gives you insights and ways to look at things in a different way. So I mean, cognitive neuropsychology has done this for a long time with patients, but importantly, synesthesia is not a disorder and people are healthy, and that makes it much easier to do research with them because they're happy to come in and do tasks and help us understand more about what's happening in the brain and during these experiences.
I love all that. I love everything you said there.
Lack of motivation hits everybody. For me, as a morning person, it usually hits me like a steam train in the evening. I just suddenly feel restless. I'm moving around in my chair, and I really just can't access that deep focused work that I want to. I've noticed that having a go-to solution for when that demotivation inevitably hits can really make a big difference. And for the past month, I've been going to the sponsor of this episode, Brain.fm. Brain.fm is a science-backed music app made for your brain, making it a fantastic sponsor for a neuroscience podcast. Depending what mood you're in, you can select for focus, relax, sleep, or meditate, and Brain.fm will play a mix of neural beats which have been proven to support attention and working memory. It works through a really cool mechanism called neural entrainment. The oscillatory brainwave activity in your brain basically syncs up with the cadence of the music, and this has been shown in studies to help sustain attention, concentration, and focus. The second I feel my motivation slip, I reach for my AirPods, put it in focus mode, and I can even track the extra focused work I do. I really couldn't recommend it more, and there's absolutely zero cost to trying it out. All you have to do is click my link in the description for a 30-day free trial. Let me know how you get on in the comments.
I have to echo that statement by, I just did a podcast with a aphantasia researcher called Joel Pearson. Aphantasia, I think, is this other just fascinating condition where, people are just clearly experiencing the world and their own inner conscious experience is just so radically different. But to this effect that we all experience it so differently, my sister works with me and she was editing a video. And she was just doing one of these apple tests, close your eyes, see if you can visualize an apple. And at the age of 31, after a long career of being an artist and a creative and running a jewelry business and doing all this, she realized that she had basically full-blown sensory aphantasia. So she can't visualize any imagery in her mind's eye. Not only that, but now we've realized that she can't imagine taste, she can't imagine smell. And this was blowing my mind. How does someone go 31 years without realizing that they can imagine these sensations? And it's just gotten me so interested in this question of trying to understand people's conscious experience. How do you think we can make progress on that question? Because it's really hard, because even when I ask my sister, like she's moving into a new apartment and she's already thinking about how she's going to decorate it. And in my mind, I'm like, but how? Like, how are you doing that? Because you can't visualize it. And she can't really explain to me. So like, how can we understand each other's conscious experience? Like, that's really what I'm so interested in at the moment.
I think that's a really fascinating question and something that has puzzled psychologists and philosophers and a lot of people for many, many years.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like things with like finding out that you don't see the world in the same way as somebody else can be mind-blowing when it's a phenomenon like that. So I quite often have the same tale of people with synesthesia. So somebody won't realize that they perceive the world in a different way until they hear something like a podcast, right?
Yeah.
And then they're like, hang on a minute. And they'll get in touch and they're like, so I then went and asked my friends, and it turns out that they don't, see colors every time they smell and avoid the fish market because they don't like those colors. So I think I might have synesthesia. And so that I think that's an illustration of the fact that most of the time we just make assumptions, right?
Yeah.
And even at a not a perceptual way of thinking, if you think about the way we perceive the world, it is completely entrenched in our own experience. And so I think actually, at the risk of going beyond my scientific expertise, I think that leads to a lot of polarization in a whole lot of other ways in society,
Yes.
right? Because I don't know what it's like to be a refugee. I have a lot of empathy, and I've done some reading, and I've met people, and so I start to imagine it, and so I'm more compassionate towards refugees. But that is because I've sought out experiences that are to try and inform myself. If you have never conceived of a situation where your home might be at risk, your children might be at risk, and you have no control over it, then the understanding isn't there that
Yes.
this might actually be something that's worth supporting, right? I mean, that's just one example, but I think right through from understanding that other people might not perceive the world in the same way goes all the way through to our understanding of other people and their views and their politics and their beliefs, which all shape the way we then interpret incoming information.
Yes.
So, the way that we even hear what somebody's saying is influenced by whether or not we perceive them as being part of our group, right? And so
Yes.
there's, I think if we can understand more about how we can understand someone else's experience, maybe we'd solve a lot of problems, not just about understanding perception.
Right. I couldn't agree more. I really, really couldn't agree more. Is there any developmental theories with synesthesia? So, like, you could assume maybe someone is developing there in their critical period of brain wiring and development, and all of those natural pruning processes are happening. Maybe somebody is on a Wednesday, and then a particular thing happens, and then they start forming those associations, right? Maybe they see the color red, and then they also smell something, and then the brain makes those associations, and then maybe that happens a number of times. Is there some idea with synesthesia that maybe it's a developmental wiring thing with associations in their environment?
There's certainly theories that might be the case. It's super hard to test, right?
Yes.
So there's a couple of papers where people have gone back and looked at the fridge magnets, the colors of fridge magnets, and
Right.
are able to trace a particular synesthete's colors back to the fridge magnets. But then you have other people who say, oh, I remember those fridge magnets. I hated the M because it was the wrong color, right? So it's like, it might work for a couple of people. During my PhD, I spent a very enjoyable 3 months in the State Library of Victoria, looking at children's books that were published around the time that my synesthetes, I had a big sample of synesthetes, and I had all of their colors for letters. And I was trying to find evidence, test the hypothesis that there was some learning, there must be learning somewhere, right? We're not born with a genetic blueprint even of what language we're going to speak, let alone a color that might go with it, right? So while there might be a genetic predisposition to develop synesthesia, there must be learning somewhere. And so I looked through all these children's books. Turns out I didn't find much in the way because of evidence, because a lot of my synesthetes were at the time in their 50s. And so if you look back at the children's books that they had, they tended to be, like just two-tone, for example.
Right.
But others, there's certainly some patterns across people. So, for example, if you look across a big sample of synesthetes and you ask just, what colours are evoked by different letters, about half the alphabet has consistent, as in more than you'd expect by chance, colours associated with it. So A tends to be red, for example. So about 40% of synesthetes will have some flavour of red. Okay, I shouldn't say flavour then, I'm really getting synesthetic on you. But within the category of red.
Yes.
But if you ask non-synesthetes, just choose a color to go with A, about 60% of them will say red, right? So that suggests there's like common learning, and it would make sense that there's something driven by the environment. But whether or not that's a direct, you get additional wiring, whether there's a critical period. Many cognitive processes have a critical period, like developing your native language, for example, that requires exposure. But in general, the infant brain is a sponge for association, right? That's what we're doing as infants, is we are absorbing sensory information and we're going, what is that, right? This voice goes with that face, goes with this sound, dada. Okay, those things are going to be linked. So we're making associations all the time. And one of the puzzles with synesthesia is it that at the start, some people say, well, maybe we're all synesthetes to start with, and then most of us lose it, or is it that pre-language we don't have it, and we have anecdotal reports of people who say they remember before starting school, so before becoming literate. So one of my synesthetes, for example, she says she vividly remembers her sister, who was 2 years older than her, coming back from school, and she was lying there waiting for her blue sister to come home, from school. So she's got this very vivid memory of already having colours associated with her sister.
Right.
It's an open question. It's very hard. Daphne Mara has done some nice work trying to get at whether or not toddlers might have synesthesia, and so she's done some studies where she tries to get them to sort little X's and little O's into boxes and see whether there's any consistency. But it's very, very hard work.
For sure. Just by virtue of the kind of questions that we're probing at, the experiments must be so difficult to really conclusively prove anything. I'm curious because I remember some vaguely like synesthesia experience that I used to have as a child, but I'm curious if you would categorize it as such. So I remember being like 6 or 7 years old, and whenever I was making a decision on what video game to play, I would associate a shape to it. And I always remember that, and I was always very consistent with the shape that I would apply and whatever emotional valence that shape would mean. So like a circle would mean I could play a game and I would feel good about it and I could tell my friends about it. I don't know if that's something to do with a circle having some social relation or something, but I remember having, and it was the 4 shapes on a PlayStation controller because I was 7, so that was my whole life. And a triangle meant a particular thing, a square meant a particular thing, and an X, I was never playing a game that felt like an X. That was just clearly wrong. A circle, whatever. And it would change, like the games would change shape because how I felt about them would change on a different day, but the experience, like the emotional valence, would always be connected to a shape. Now that's sort of different from having a emotion connected to a Wednesday or something. But like, do you think synesthesia goes a lot further than that, where it's really just connecting any two modalities that aren't usually paired together, and we don't know why they're paired, but for some reason they are?
Yeah, I mean, I think that could be arguably a form of synesthesia, that there's an emotion with a shape. The changes that relate to your emotions that are related to your games would potentially be classified as synesthesia because it's an unusual experience to an ordinary event.
Right.
I mean, so there's quite a few people say that they think they had synesthesia as children and then they don't have it anymore, but they can remember it. And so you can use the subjective reports to kind of distinguish between, do you currently experience it or do you just remember having it? But there we come into the problem or the challenge of introspection not being particularly reliable.
Yes.
And certainly it's limited in terms of how much we can find out about like the cognitive and neural underpinnings of a phenomenon. So I think one of the challenges with all studies of perception is that at some point when you want to know about the experience, you have to ask someone about the experience. And then we're super limited in communicating about experience because we've got this clunky language that doesn't really allow me to describe what it's like to experience that color or that shape or that emotion. So I think one of the exciting things about doing research in synesthesia and in perception in general is coming up with clever ways to look at the effect of that experience on something else so that you can measure it.
Right.
So while I could ask you what are the color, what are the colors of these letters, and I could even get you, if you're a synesthete, to sit down and we can match them on a computer screen or using coloring pencils, and we can try and get it as close as possible until you say that's a pretty good match. Actually, that looks like the right color for that letter. That's kind of as far as we can go. But if it's a consistent experience, then I can set up situations where your synesthesia should interfere if it's involuntary. And so this is what we and other people have done. In my honours year, I actually long time ago now, did the first group study of synesthesia using a method like this, where effectively we set up a situation where the colour of a letter could either match someone's synesthetic experience evoked by that letter, or we could change it so that, for instance, A might evoke a synesthetic red, but we were presenting it in yellow. And if you ask people to just name the display colour, right, effectively now we're saying just ignore your synesthesia. If you could turn it off, you would, right, because it's only going to interfere in the task. Name the display colour as quickly as you can. What you find is that for most people, they can't prevent the synesthetic experience from slowing them down.
Right.
So they see an A, they've got the synesthetic experience of red, but they're trying to say yellow in that incongruent case. And they're slower in that condition than if I present them with an A that's in the congruent colour for them. So a red A, for example. And this builds on the same logic as the classic Stroop effect, right? So if you see the word red written in red, you're going to be faster to say red than if you see the word green written in red and you're trying to say red. So it uses the same logic of if you could prevent yourself from reading the word in the Stroop effect, then you would, but you tend not to be able to, and so it interferes. It slows your reaction time down.
Right.
And so these type of methods, although they don't tell us anything about the nature of the experience, they do give us an index that it's happening.
Yes.
It's an indirect measure. And it's objective in the sense that we're no longer asking people about their experiences. We're sort of saying, just ignore that, do this task, but the fact that it interferes tells me something about your synesthesia.
Yeah, really good example. It's so interesting. I find it really something I didn't know. Lots of things I didn't know, but one thing you mentioned that I didn't know was that there was some consistency with the letter A having the color red. That's a bit strange, isn't it? Does that mean that there has to be some connection, real world in inverted commas, if such a thing exists, some environmental association between red and the letter A? Like if people are forming that association, it must exist somewhere in the environment, right?
Well, it could, or it could be that other than black and white, red is the most frequent colour and A is a very frequent letter. It could be when you learn the alphabet, you start with A, and when you learn colours, you probably start with red. There's likely to be a whole host of factors that lead to particular associations being more likely than others. And, finding out which of those is contributing is a tricky proposition. But there are studies, as we get more and more data and we see how strong these patterns are, there are various post hoc explanations for how it might be, right? D tends to be evoke brown, right? And almost immediately people usually go, oh, D is for dog, and dogs are often brown. Oh, that sounds perfectly adequate. But who knows, right? It's a just so story. I think in one of our papers, I think that might even be the example I gave.
Wow.
It also is probably that where there's these underlying statistical regularities in the environment, we probably all use them. So, for example, if you look at the synesthetic experiences evoked by sounds, there tends to be an underlying pattern of low-pitched notes evoking dark colours, large objects that are low in space,
Cool.
and high-pitched sounds being evoking colours that are high up in space, smaller objects, and bright colours or light colours. So, for example, a trombone is likely for many synesthetes to evoke a very dark colour, broad brushstrokes, low in space, and a flute something high up in space and maybe yellow or light in some way. And if you look at non-synesthetes and you force them to make choices, their choices follow the same patterns.
Interesting.
And so a lot of different types of synesthesia seem to build on cross-modal mechanisms that we all seem to have. It's just that in most of us, it's implicit. So if you stick me in a room and you ask me to adjust the color of a light or intensity to match a tone, I can do that actually quite systematically. I just don't experience anything with it. If you ask a synesthete, here are some tones, pick some colors that go with it, there is likely to be that same underlying pattern. And that kind of makes sense, right? I mean, it's highly unlikely, in my view, that synesthetes have a fundamentally different brain to the rest of us. I think it's far more likely that what we have is a dimension of, as I said before, human experience, and synesthesia might be at the extreme end, or maybe it shows us insights into things that are unconscious in the rest of us. I'm not saying we're all synesthetes. I don't know that. But it certainly seems to build on mechanisms that we all have. And those mechanisms are likely to be influenced by statistical regularities in our environment. So, for example, think about just that multisensory case that we just talked about. Small dogs tend to make higher pitched barks than large dogs. Small birds, large birds, right? So you can almost immediately identify regularities in the environment that could lead to an implicit belief in or unconscious representation in your brain that associates things that are high-pitched with smaller things than things that are low-pitched. And so synesthesia might build on those mechanisms.
It's a really good example. That's interesting to think about. So while a synesthetic association might explicitly seem random, there is some underlying nature to it, or likely some underlying nature to it in the environment that things do co-present, and the brain is able to make an association between them, but in our conscious mind, they seem completely detached. That's a really interesting one.
I think so. I think there's enough underlying sort of mechanisms and links that might allow the brain to do that. It's also possible that some of them are completely random just to mess you around, right?
Yes, just to make science fun.
So one of the interesting questions is if there is something that you've seen in the environment that somehow latches on in a synesthete and becomes established, why doesn't it get unlearned if you see lots of instances that don't match it?
Right.
So this is an interesting question when you were asking about the development of synesthesia. If there's a critical period, then maybe during that critical period you get exposed to something and that leads to a link that then is somehow preserved despite multiple learning opportunities to unlearn it, if you like.
Yes.
We don't really know very much about that.
If you put someone with synesthesia in an MRI and you really looked at different things like brain connectivity, do you see anything functionally different when they have a synesthetic experience?
So there's lots of different ways to look at what's happening in the brain, and brain connectivity is one. The papers that are out there, well, there's kind of a few different ways that people have focused on what's happening in the brain in synesthesia. Early on, it was we were really focused on whether the regions that are active during colour perception in everyone are also active in synesthetes when they're experiencing their synesthetic colours. So classic colour perception area V4, for example. And so quite a few studies were trying to look at whether or not you get activity in V4 when somebody's experiencing synesthetic colour, and the results are really mixed. In our study, we found that when people are imagining colour voluntarily, you get activity in V4. And in synesthesia, it was like in areas around. There were definitely occipital areas that seemed to be more related to, say, colour knowledge. Other studies have found that for some synesthetes it activates V4. So those sort of questions are around like what brain areas are involved in synesthesia. Then there's a couple of studies that have tried to look at whether or not there's more connectivity or white matter connections between different brain areas in synesthetes. But the study that I'm actually most proud of is a recent study by one of my PhD students, Lena Teichmann, who did, we've been using magnetoencephalography, or MEG, to look at patterns of brain activity. So MEG is amazing in the sense that you can use these super sensitive sensors at the scalp to detect the tiny magnetic fields generated by populations of neurons firing together. So every time you've got a neuron that's firing, that's an electrical signal. And if enough of them are firing at the same time and in the same way, each of those electrical signals has a 90-degree perpendicular magnetic signal that it gives off. And if enough of them are doing the same thing, and you have a very expensive shielded room that gets rid of the rest of the magnetic fields from the world, which are far stronger than these teeny tiny little magnetic fields that we're trying to record at the surface, then you can get some really interesting information. It's effectively a measure of your neural activity. Yes. And we've been combining MEG with multivariate pattern analyses, which allow us to look at the pattern of signals across the brain. So bear with me. It's super cool. Very hard to do without visual aids. We'll see how we go. So if you look at the pattern of brain activity when somebody is seeing red, so we showed people a whole lot of red abstract shapes that varied in luminance but were all within the colour category red, and we had a whole lot of those same abstract shapes but coloured green. And we showed people who were, while we were recording MEG, lots of red objects and lots of green objects. And then we trained a computer algorithm to distinguish, based on the brain activity, whether or not the person was seeing red or green. Okay, so basically you take the participant's data and you feed it into the computer, say this was a red trial. Here's another red trial. Here's the data from a green trial. And you give it lots and lots of training data. And then you give it a new set of give it a new pattern of brain activity from that same person. You say, was this a red trial or a green trial? If there's information about colour in the pattern of neural activity, then the computer should be able to determine above chance whether or not the person was seeing red or green. Yeah. So, well, first we had to develop the methods to do that. We did that. Then we had synesthetes, and we asked them to look at all of these red and green, but we also had letters that we knew for this person evoked a synesthetic red and a synesthetic green.
Right, cool.
And we trained the computer algorithm on them actually seeing, what we would all agree is red and green, unless you were colourblind, but we won't go there. And then we tested that computer algorithm on data from when they were seeing the letters that evoke either synesthetic red or green. We said, is this a red trial or a green trial? And the computer algorithm worked in the sense that there was information in that signal about the synesthetic colour that was being perceived. And it was similar enough to what's happening when synesthetes are looking at red and green items that the classifier could work. But there was a delay. So if you do it for, I'm going to show you, here's some neural data, were they seeing red or green? And it was from a perceptual trial where the stimulus was actually reflecting red or green. Then it happened in a couple of 100 milliseconds. If it was the data from the synesthete being shown a letter that's achromatic, so it doesn't actually reflect any colour, but for them it was red or green, then there was an additional delay before that representation was instantiated in the brain. So there's enough there's overlap, and that this is basically like a neural marker of their synesthetic colour experience. And it's probably the closest we can get to saying what's the nature of the experience. We can't say what the nature is, but we can say it's similar to what happens when you and I see things that we would call red and green, right? It's just with a delay. And the delay makes sense because a lot of our research suggests that you have to identify the letter before you get the colour, right? And that kind of makes sense. If you have an experience that A is red, you probably need to identify the A, and then you get all of the evoked associations, including the colour. Right. And we think that's what's happening in that delay. And it matches up quite nicely with a study we did with non-synesthetes where we showed them grayscale objects that are canonically red or green. So, for example, a tomato, broccoli, and so, the objects are achromatic, but they evoke an association for all of us that they would normally be red or green. And again, you get the same sort of thing where you can train a classifier on perceiving red or green and test it on the neural data from these grayscale objects, and you again get an overlapping neural pattern just with a delay. So again, that idea that it's the concept that's activating it. So it's almost like we can use one thing we don't understand to find out more about something else we don't understand.
Right. It's such cool research, though. It's really, really interesting. I wonder, what if you give them like an ambiguous signal? So if they have different associations between an A and a B, and you give them some sort of A-B hybrid, will their synesthesia experience then be the hybrid of those two associations, if you see what I mean?
So what, I don't know if anyone's done exactly that one, but it tends to be people's experience go with how they identify it. And that's one of the sources of evidence that really it seems to be the concept that's activating it.
Right.
So, for example, if you embed a stimulus in noise, so they can't see it, you're making it stronger and stronger, when they identify it, they also have the color. If you have an ambiguous stimulus like a digital 2, digital 5, I might have to draw it to see which one. But you put it within a word, so it should be identified as an S. Does that make sense? Let me just check that. So if you have, I don't know if we're recording visuals, but if you have a digital 5, that could be interpreted as a number, or it could be interpreted as a letter, right? It could be an S or it could be a 5. If I present it to you in a word, then you're likely to perceive it as an S. If I present it to you in a stream of digits, you're likely to perceive it as a 5. And synesthetes tend to get the colour that goes with the interpretation, even though the stimulus itself is the same. So in a stream of digits, they'll see a 5 colour, and if it's in a stream of letters, then they'll see an S colour.
That's a really cool example. I love all this, and I love the experiments. I think they're so interesting. What do you think are some of the largest discoveries of perception in general from the study of synesthesia?
I think in our attempts to study synesthesia, we've developed really useful methods that are then able to be used for studying perception in other ways. So, for example, in the study I was telling you about, our MEG study, before we could work out whether or not synesthetes' brains, the pattern of activation looks the same when they're experiencing synesthetic colours versus colours that from stimuli we would all agree give colour experiences. We had to develop the methods to be able to decode whether someone was seeing red or green. And then we also were able to then start looking at object colour knowledge, which is something that we have a hypothesis that maybe the synesthetic experience is linked to the inducer in a similar way to the way object colour knowledge is entrenched for most of us. So if I show you a banana, even if I show it to you in grayscale, as soon as you activate the concept of a banana, it quite likely has a very strong association of colour yellow, right? And so even when I say the word banana, there's a whole lot of things that get activated, maybe that they're sweet, maybe whether or not you like them, that you have to peel it, and probably that it's yellow, that it starts with a B, how it's spelt, how the word looks. All of these things are probably automatically activated in your brain just when you hear the word banana.
Yes.
And maybe for synesthetes, the same sort of binding happens when they hear a letter, that a letter has that information in it. Just like for the rest of us, those objects that have canonical colours. So in wanting to study the nature of synesthetic experience, we've ended up also developing methods that allow us to start looking at the way in which we hold information about objects, perceptual information about objects that we interact with all the time. I think also the interest in synesthesia has quite broad implications. So the philosophers get very excited because there's the notion that you're experiencing two qualia at the same time. Right. Because a synesthete typically doesn't experience any interference with vision from these colours, right? You don't get low-level colour mixing. If I put a filter in front of your eyes that's coloured and I show you something, then you will describe that there's some sort of mixing. But in synesthesia, they describe, well, I've got this colour and I can see what's really out there. So you've got these two qualia at the same time.
Yes.
Philosophers, I think, have a lot of fun with synesthesia because there's a lot of different kind of thought experiments that you have to go through. Well, hang on, how could this work and what does it mean about the way that the brain develops and the way that our perception and our experience of the world might develop?
Very cool. I like that example about concepts, because it really supports this this sort of this new wave of ideas that we are we we build the world from our own models first, and then our perceptual data sort of corrects those models rather than vice versa. So it's commonly intuited that we see the world, and then we use our eyes to perceive the world, and that projects some image onto our brain. But a lot more of the more recent research on perception and emotion is much more like we build and construct models of the world based on our ideas, based on our belief system, based on our biases, based on our past experiences, associations, and everything. And then those models kind of come first, and then we use our sensory data to correct against those models and create prediction error. And I think what you gave there with synesthesia is a beautiful example of that, where it's attached to the concepts that we have about objects rather than anything that they might be objectively perceiving. It's a tomato versus a black and white circle with a stalk and maybe a little shine mark or something. So we really do navigate this world based on our own preconceived models, and our sensory system corrects against that, which I just think is a profoundly interesting and cool idea that I wish more people knew about.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work looking at these predictive processing ideas, and whether or not what we're constantly doing is essentially making a best guess. Your brain's making a best guess about what's out there, and then you kind of test that against what's incoming, and there's this iterative loop. It's certainly the case that there's a whole lot of feedback happening in the brain. It's not that simple feed forward flow that one might initially think of, where it's true, information hits the retina and then it gets processed, it goes through the optic nerve and heads up to the back of the brain, and there's a roughly hierarchical processing system for that. But a lot of stuff is also happening in advance of that. So my other main field of study is attention.
Yes.
And when you are looking for a particular feature, a particular color, or a particular object, there's a whole lot of feedback that happens before a stimulus even arrives on the display or auditorily or in whatever sense you're studying. So there's some studies that even suggest that attention's modulating activity at the level of the thalamus before you even get to cortex, which kind of blows my mind. Just what you're currently looking for, what's relevant for you, can modulate your brain at that deep subcortical level so that you're ready to prioritize information that matches what you're looking for.
Can you unpack that a little bit? What does that mean exactly? What's the significance of attention priming the thalamus before the cortex?
So often we talk about cortical effects of attention. So that's once you get to the cortex, that's where all the important processing goes on, and the complex processing and all of this higher cognition is all dependent on the cortical processes. But the thalamus processes sensory information from almost all the senses except olfaction before it even gets to the cortex. And so to have attentional, obviously these studies need to be replicated, and I don't do LGN work, so it's not my work directly. But the report was that the paper reported that they could see modulation of the response of neurons in the thalamus to incoming information based on what you're attending to.
Right.
And so that's very far down the what you would think of as the initial feed forward sweep of information.
Right.
But most of the work is looking at, say, if we're looking at how attention is implemented in the brain, we're looking at how frontoparietal cognitive control type networks influence, say, visual cortex when you're looking for a particular visual stimulus. So think about scanning a crowd, and you're looking for your friend, and she's wearing a red top. You can actually pretty effectively limit your search to people who are wearing red. And if you know that your friend, you don't know what they're wearing, but they're sitting in the top left, I don't know if this is mirrored or not,
Yes.
then you effectively direct your attention to a location in space really effectively and limit your search to that relevant spot. And so there's a whole lot of ways in which what we attend to determines what we see. And we're able to use it to search effectively, but also we tend not to be aware of things that we're not attending to. So that's another whole conversation. There's various suggestions in the literature that psychedelics can evoke a synesthesia-like experience. There's obviously some pretty fundamental differences, like it tends not to be consistent, so not the same sound. People have suggested that taking LSD or mescaline can result in synesthetic-like experiences in that sounds have visual components, but tends not to be consistent. And it also, of course, depends on like a particular level of the drug in your system, and there are other risks associated with it. I'm not suggesting you all go out and try it. So some people have said that there's various drug experiences that can get a semblance of synesthesia. Certainly we can train people to have very strong associations, but the difference tends to be in whether or not they experience the colour, right? And so with the Stroop type experiment that I explained earlier, where we can see indirect effects of synesthesia, you can train a non-synesthete to show those same effects. Or if I use the letters that are commonly the start of colour names, so R for red and G for green, and then I manipulate the congruency of that, we can see that those sort of effects in non-synesthetes. The difference is that they don't say that they've seen it. So it comes back to where we started, which is, how do we understand conscious experience? How can we study somebody's internal world? So I don't think that I don't know of any way that we can exactly experience what a synesthete experiences. There are nice ways in which we can ask synesthetes to, quite a few synesthete artists use their synesthesia in their work. And so you get a sense of what it might be if you listen to the song that they were painting, for example. Carol Steen is a lovely American artist from New York who's also a synesthete, and she's very generously let me use her artwork and her descriptions of the song that she was listening to when she painted it to kind of illustrate auditory visual synesthesia. And, you get a sense of what it might be like. It's not the same as having synesthesia, of course.
Unfortunately, my Riverside basically decided to just stop working here, but the question I ask Anina is surrounding the evidence behind creativity and synesthesia.
Strong evidence, no. But one of the challenges is, again, right, how do you study creativity? How do you measure it? If we just take, in our work, what we did in one of my early studies was we took basically an arbitrarily defined version of what creativity might be by saying, okay, any occupation that involves something that we would consider artistic, we're going to count as a creative occupation. And so we basically used people's, whether they were employed as an artist, sculptor, musician, architect, graphic design, all of the occupations that you might think of that have a creative component. And we looked at proportions of synesthetes that were involved in those occupations compared to the Australian census data from that year. And what we found was that amongst our synesthetes, about 24% were involved in those artistic occupations. And from the census data, it was about 2% of the population. So that could mean that synesthetes are likely to be in artistic occupations, and maybe you could infer from that they're more creative. Or it could be that synesthetes who are artistic are more likely to contact a research group and do a study in synesthesia, right? So you always have to have some caveats around that. Having said that, there are various, there are a lot of artists and musicians who can describe how they use their synesthesia in their work. So, yeah, you have to ask not just every synesthete if they're an artist, but also every artist if they're a synesthete, to try and get at the bottom of that. And all of those correlations are always hard to get at. So there's some evidence, but with those caveats.
What does synesthesia tell us about consciousness and the human conscious experience? Again, really difficult question. I know every time I ask these kind of questions, I can feel them going, but I have to ask them anyway. What do you think are some of the biggest things we've learned about conscious experience through the study of synesthesia?
I think it's broad level, provoking us to think about the inherent subjectivity of perception. So when we were talking about our MEG study, and I was telling you that we can use these methods to compare the brain pattern that's happening during synesthetic color experience to the brain pattern that's happening during color experience that's not synesthetically generated, and that there's some overlap in the pattern, even though there's a temporal delay. That's using neural methods to try and at least get it, illustrate something that we are trying to study compared with something that we at least all experience.
Yes.
Right? So by inference, I'm saying, well, I know what it's like to experience color. The brain pattern overlaps between when they are experiencing color in the way that I understand it and the way that I don't understand it, which is the synesthetic color. So perhaps the nature of those experiences are the same.
Yes.
But of course that doesn't, I mean, it's still mechanistic. It's still, our computer algorithm can detect just above chance that it was a synesthetic red versus a synesthetic green, right? We're a long way from understanding what that experience might be like.
Right.
So I think, it's provoking those questions and provoking that, that kind of questioning of our assumptions about the world.
Yes.
That's useful. I also really like the fact that synesthesia provokes people to think about science. And it's one of the rare things that we can talk about, and nobody says to me, well, actually, no, that's not true. People do say, but why would you study it? It's not going to cure cancer. It's not going to lead to more money. It's not going to design faster cars. Why do we study it? And yet people are inherently fascinated by it.
Of course.
Right? And I personally, I'm a fundamental researcher. So I'm interested in understanding how the brain works. And from that understanding, in whatever field you're looking at, that fundamental basic research then has many applications, lots of which we won't even have conceived of yet. So I firmly believe that we need to have that fundamental science that is for curiosity's sake, right? To understand the normal healthy system. And then there'll be loads of benefits later on that I might not have even thought might be related to this research. We are moving more and more rapidly towards a situation where research is funded and valued based on what application it immediately has.
Right.
And I think the problem with that is that you end up losing innovation, because you're very much so. If I, for example, in my attention research, I have some studies that look at the effect of talking on the phone while you're driving, because that's generally a bad idea. We have a limited capacity attention. It's going to impact on safety. But we actually already know that from the fundamental research. It's just that to translate it, you need like a specific experiment. That fundamental research on attentional capacity limits is relevant not just to driving, but also lifeguards at the pool and teachers in their classroom. And, that fundamental research can inform a whole lot of fields. And I think with synesthesia, it has an inherent interest in the sense that it's fascinating that other people might see the world in a different way. And for synesthetes, it's also often nice to hear about, this is a genuine phenomenon that's fascinating to scientists, and we're using it to try and understand more about how we all perceive the world.
Right.
So, I think doing the fundamental science is really important, and being able to articulate why it's important is important. And synesthesia is a nice one because it really captures the imagination, but doesn't have an immediate application. So it's a nice way of saying, see, this is worth studying because it helps us understand the human brain.
Right. Which should be valuable in and of itself. There should be an intrinsic drive and an intrinsic reward in just trying to understand humanity. And I think we can almost take it on faith that there's going to be some benefits to that down the line, even if we can't put it in the accountancy and say we're going to make 100 grand next quarter because we've discovered how a synesthesia response is. Although my suspicion is that maybe that information will become valuable to AI companies as they try and train their models and trying to understand conscious experience, that possibly OpenAI will be knocking on your research lab's door and saying, we want to understand here how emotional modalities are connecting up because we think that could be valuable to AI agents. And hopefully that has a positive effect. We don't know. But I think that information might become more important as, AI becomes more sophisticated and you have these AI agents that are operating, maybe understanding the synesthesia experience is important in that training. At the moment, all they have is language, but maybe what they need is conscious experience. And that's what will help them do all of the productive things that, they keep telling us they're going to do.
Maybe. I mean, look, there are a lot of, I don't mean to downplay how much application synesthesia research might have. For example, in advertising, looking at the way that people like to see sensory information together can be useful. For designing warning systems, if you have, synesthesia is like if synesthesia is an exaggerated version of these implicit mappings that we all have, then we can use the patterns that are evident in synesthetic data to predict what will be most effective for everybody, right? So, for example, one of my earlier PhD students, Rocco Chow, he did a really nice study where all we did was we played a tone that was either high-pitched or low-pitched prior to a visual display coming up. And the task was just to detect a little visual flash, so close to threshold, so hard to see, that was either above or below fixation, and to respond accordingly. And what we found was that if you had a high-pitched tone, people were faster if the flash appeared above the fixation, and if it was a low-pitched tone, they were faster below than the opposite. But the effect was like 10 milliseconds. So it was reliable, but in non-synesthetes, it's about 10 milliseconds. But in synesthetes, we know that these low notes evoke typically dark colors and big objects. And so the effects tend to be correspondingly much larger. Now, if I'm designing an aeroplane cockpit and I want to have a warning tone, then I would suggest that if it's a dial that's up high, you want to have a high-pitched tone that goes with it. And if it's a dial that's down low, you want to have a low-pitched tone that goes with it.
Cool.
Okay? And probably engineers are using these rules intuitively. But now we have the research to kind of say, this is what you should be doing.
Right. I think that's a cool I think that's a really cool example. What's the future of synesthesia research? If you had your 10 million euro in funding, 10 billion, whatever the number is, where would you place it? What would be the big techniques that you would try and develop? Like, what technology is required to figure out these questions? Like, talk around that to finish off.
I think the time now, the things we need to do now is really flesh out the relationship between different types of synesthesia. Are we clustering things together that make sense because they're the same phenomenon, or should we really be partialing it out? And how does it relate to the broader concepts of cognition? So language, cognitive control, multisensory integration more generally, understanding semantics and how we hold concepts, how do we understand the world around us, and that interaction between what we know about the world and what we perceive. So I think integrating where our synesthesia research fits within those bigger systems is where we need to go.
Very cool. I love it. I think your work is so important. I think it's incredibly, incredibly important. Again, I think it's the biggest question we have is understanding ourselves, understanding our conscious experience. So I think the work that you do is invaluable. And I think you're an amazing communicator at telling all these different stories and really relaying the importance to the general public. So thank you so much for having the conversation. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for the work that you do, and super excited to see what you do in the next couple of decades, because I'm sure it's going to be really, really exciting.
Thanks very much.